Part 1. The Ghosts of the Past. This was the second war, the one that was never supposed to happen, the war that flowed from the failures of the first. A global firestorm that would consume more than 60 million lives, redraw the map of the world, and unleash upon humanity the terrifying, ultimate power of the atom. It was a war of annihilation, of ideologies locked in a death struggle for the future of civilization, a conflict that eclipsed even the unimaginable horrors of the Great War that had preceded it. But this firestorm, this global apocalypse, wasn't truly lit in 1939. Its long, slow-burning fuse was set 20 years earlier, not on a battlefield, but here. In this magnificent hall, a symbol of absolute power and royal vanity, during a conference that promised the world a permanent, just, and lasting peace. They called the first conflict the war to end all wars. Its conclusion was meant to be a new dawn, a world made safe for democracy. But the document they signed in this hall, the Treaty of Versailles, would become one of history's most catastrophic failures. It was not a treaty of peace, it was a treaty of vengeance. It was a victor's justice that guaranteed another, more terrible war. This is the story of how the best intentions of well-meaning men, corrupted by the thirst for revenge and haunted by the ghosts of the dead, created the perfect blueprint for disaster. This is the story of the fatal peace. Act 1. A peace built on quicksand. The ghosts of the Somme. To understand peace, you must first understand the war. And to understand the war, you must understand that it was something new in human history. This wasn't a war of cavalry charges and heroic duels. It was a war of industry, a war of attrition. It was the grinding, impersonal slaughter of the machine gun, the gas canister, and the artillery shell. The goal was not to outmaneuver the enemy, but to bleed him white, to kill so many of his sons that his nation would simply break. The numbers are so vast they become meaningless, but they represent a continent's worth of broken hearts. For 4 years, Europe fed its youth into this meat grinder. 900 Frenchmen died every single day. 1,500 Germans. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme alone, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties. A generation of Europe's future leaders, artists, scientists, and fathers was wiped from the earth, leaving behind a void of grief and loss that shaped everything that was to come. And this total war was not confined to the trenches. It reached into every home. The British blockade of Germany caused mass malnutrition, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians. Every economy was strained to the breaking point, every society militarized. By 1919, the nations sitting at the peace table were not the same ones that had entered the war in 1914. They were exhausted, indebted, and traumatized, and they were burning for someone to blame. No one embodied this national will more than Georges Clemenceau. Born in 1841, he was a living link to France's previous humiliation. As a young man, he had watched Prussian troops march through Paris in 1871. He had seen his nation dismembered, the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine torn away. As Prime Minister during the darkest days of the war, his iron resolve had prevented France's collapse. For Clemenceau, this was not just a political negotiation. It was personal. It was existential. He famously told his colleagues, "America is far away, protected by the ocean. Not even Napoleon himself could touch England. You are both sheltered. We are not." His single, overriding, non-negotiable goal was security for France. And that security could only be achieved through the permanent weakening of Germany. Arriving into this cauldron of old-world hatreds was an American president unlike any other. Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and he carried with him a profound sense of moral righteousness. He was an academic, a political scientist who believed that the sins of humanity could be cured by rational thought and well-designed institutions. He saw the war as a tragic failure of secret treaties, imperial rivalries, and cynical balance of power diplomacy. He came armed with his 14 points, a document that he believed would change the world. It was a vision of a new world order, based on transparency, national self-determination for the peoples of Europe, and above all, collective security. Its crown jewel was the League of Nations, a global parliament where disputes could be settled with words, not with weapons. For Wilson, the treaty was not about punishing Germany. It was about reforming the entire world to prevent another catastrophe. He saw himself not as a victor, but as a crusader who was about to collide with the brutal realities of European politics. Caught in the middle was Britain's David Lloyd George. The Welsh wizard was a canny political operator. He had just won a massive election victory at home on populist slogans like "Hang the Kaiser" and "Squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak." The British public, having lost nearly 1 million men, demanded retribution. But Lloyd George was also a pragmatist. He knew that a stable, prosperous Germany was essential for the economy of Europe. He feared that crushing Germany completely, as Clemenceau wished, would only create a permanent state of grievance that would inevitably lead to another war. More immediately, he feared it would push a desperate Germany towards the new Bolshevik revolution raging in Russia, a prospect that terrified him. He famously quipped that he was sitting between Jesus Christ and Napoleon Bonaparte. And then there was the fourth member of the Big Four, Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Italy had been lured into the war on the Allied side by secret promises of territory from the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Orlando came to Paris expecting to collect his prize. But the other leaders, particularly Wilson with his talk of self-determination, dismissed Italy's claims. Italy, having suffered immense casualties, was largely ignored and humiliated. This Vittoria Mutilata, or mutilated victory, would have its own dark consequences, creating a sense of national grievance that would directly fuel the rise of another dictator, Benito Mussolini. The seeds of fascism were being sown in the same room as the seeds of Nazism, the Hall of Mirrors. The choice of venue was a masterstroke of political theatre. It was steeped in the poison of past humiliations. It was here, in this very hall, on January 18th, 1871, that the German Empire had been proclaimed after its swift and brutal victory over France in the Franco-Prussian War. For Clemenceau, forcing Germany to accept its defeat here was the perfect, symbolic act of revenge. A national shame erased by an even greater one, being inflicted on his enemy. Paris in 1919 was the capital of the world. Delegations came from every corner of the globe, hoping that Wilson's promise of self-determination would apply to them. Arabs who had fought the Ottoman Empire, Vietnamese seeking freedom from French colonialism, Zionists dreaming of a national home. But they would soon discover that Wilson's grand principles were meant primarily for the white nations of Europe. The old imperial powers, Britain and France, had no intention of dismantling their own empires. They were there to divide the spoils of the defeated. From the very beginning, this was not a peace conference. It was a victor's court. The defeated powers were not invited to the negotiating table. For months, the Allied powers argued amongst themselves, hammering out the terms in secret, a direct contradiction of Wilson's open covenants promise. The Germans could only wait, virtual prisoners, hoping for a peace based on the 14 points, the very principles the Allies had offered them to convince them to lay down their arms. On May 7th, 1919, the German delegation was finally presented with the terms. The document was over 200 pages long. As Brockdorff-Rantzau read it, his aristocratic composure gave way to visible shock and horror. This was not the peace of reconciliation they had been promised. It was, in his words, a death sentence. In a gesture of defiance that was seen as profoundly arrogant by the Allies, he remained seated as he delivered his reply, his voice trembling with rage. Brockdorff-Rantzau: "Gentlemen, we are under no illusions as to the extent of our defeat and the degree of our powerlessness. It is demanded of us that we shall confess ourselves to be the only ones guilty of war. Such a confession in my mouth would be a lie. We are far from seeking to escape from any responsibility for this great war, but we energetically deny that Germany and its people were alone guilty." His protest was dismissed out of hand. The Germans were given 2 weeks to accept the terms, with no room for substantive negotiation. The only alternative was the immediate resumption of the war and an Allied invasion of a starving, blockaded and defenceless Germany. It was the ultimate ultimatum, the stab in the back. While the Allies debated in Paris, Germany was devouring itself. The Kaiser had abdicated and fled. The nation had collapsed not just from external pressure, but from internal rot. Out of this chaos, a new, fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, was born. Its first leaders were moderates, socialists, and Democrats who believed they could build a better Germany. But this republic was born in defeat and christened in blood, and it was immediately saddled with an insidious, poisonous, and powerful myth: unvanquished. That single word, spoken to the returning troops, helped launch the lie. The German army had not been decisively routed on the battlefield in the autumn of 1918. The front had not collapsed in the way the French army had in 1870. The armistice was signed while German troops were still on French and Belgian soil. This allowed the true architects of Germany's defeat, the military high command, led by Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his deputy, the brilliant but ruthless General Erich Ludendorff, to perpetrate a great deception to save their own reputations. It was the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, the idea, actively promoted by the generals themselves, that the German army had been undefeated in the field, on the cusp of victory, but was betrayed by weak, treacherous politicians on the home front, the socialists, the Democrats, the pacifists, and, increasingly, the Jews who had fomented revolution and forced the nation to surrender. It was a complete fabrication, a cynical shifting of blame. But for a nation struggling to comprehend its sudden collapse, it was a comforting, seductive lie. It preserved the honor of the military, the most respected institution in German society, and placed the entire blame for the defeat on the very politicians now trying to build a democracy. The new Weimar government, by its very first act of signing the armistice, became forever known as the November Criminals. And when they were ultimately forced to sign the humiliating Treaty at Versailles, they sealed their fate. They became the living embodiment of Germany's shame, a government founded on betrayal and disgrace. Part 2. The Chains of Versailles. Article 231. The War Guilt Clause. Of all the 440 articles in the Treaty of Versailles, none was more hated, more psychologically damaging, or more politically poisonous than Article 231. It became known in Germany simply as the Kriegsschuldlüge, the war guilt lie. On the surface, it was a legalistic clause, intended by the Allies to establish a firm basis for the financial reparations they intended to extract. But in reality, it was a moral branding iron, searing the mark of shame onto the entire German nation. The German people, and their leaders, did not believe they were solely responsible for the war. The historical reality was far more complex. They saw a Europe entangled in a web of secret alliances, a frantic arms race, and feverish imperial rivalries. They saw a Serbian nationalist assassinating an Austrian archduke and an Austrian ultimatum that Russia was bound to reject. They saw a continent stumbling into a war that no single nation had exclusively willed. To be forced, under threat of invasion, to accept the entire moral burden for the 10 million dead, for the ruined continent, was an unbearable humiliation. Philipp Scheidemann, the German chancellor who had proclaimed the new republic, resigned rather than put his name to the treaty. In his final, impassioned speech to the National Assembly, he asked the delegates, Scheidemann, "Honored delegates, to accept this treaty. No, no. A people that has endured 4 years of this cannot be made to perjure itself. This treaty is, in the view of the government, unacceptable. I ask you, who, as an honest man, can lend his hand to such a work? What hand would not wither that binds itself and us in such shackles?" But the Allies were unyielding. A telegram from Marshal Foch made the alternative brutally clear. Sign within 24 hours, or the Allied armies would cross the Rhine. Facing the certainty of a renewed blockade, starvation, and the complete dismemberment of their country, the German Assembly buckled. They voted to sign. The war guilt clause became the treaty's dark heart, a perpetual source of poison that would delegitimize the Weimar Republic and fuel the fires of nationalist extremism for the next 20 years. It transformed a military defeat into a moral condemnation, and a nation's pride into a festering wound of resentment. Reparations, a blank check and a loaded gun. The war guilt clause was the moral punishment, the reparations were the financial one. For France and Belgium, the need was not abstract. Their most productive industrial regions had been the battlefield for 4 years. They were physically and economically shattered. The French Prime Minister, Clemenceau, was under immense political pressure to ensure that Germany, whose own industrial heartland was untouched by the war, would pay for every rebuilt house, every repaired factory, every widow's pension. The demand was simple. Germany broke it, Germany must pay for it. One man in the Allied delegation saw this not as justice, but as economic madness. John Maynard Keynes, a brilliant young economist with the British Treasury, argued passionately that the scale of the reparations being discussed was not only impossible for Germany to pay, but would fundamentally shatter the integrated economy of Europe, harming the victors as much as the vanquished. He understood that Germany was the continent's industrial engine. To cripple that engine was to guarantee poverty and instability for all. The final bill was catastrophic. The final sum announced in 1921 was 132 billion gold marks. This was equivalent to nearly $400 billion in 2025. It was more than double Germany's entire gross national product. The payment schedule required Germany to pay billions of gold marks every year, a sum that far exceeded its capacity to earn through exports. To meet the crushing annual payments, the German government had little choice but to print more and more paper money. And in late 1922, when Germany inevitably defaulted on a shipment of timber and coal reparations, the French government, led by the hardline Raymond Poincaré, decided to call their bluff. In January 1923, France and Belgium invaded. Their armies occupied the Ruhr region, the home of Germany's coal, iron and steel industries, to seize their reparations in the form of raw materials. The German government, militarily powerless, called on the workers of the Ruhr to engage in a campaign of passive resistance. They were urged to go on strike, to refuse to cooperate with the occupiers, to bring the industrial heart of Germany to a standstill. The government promised to keep paying their wages. The occupation of the Ruhr was a disaster for everyone. The German economy ground to a halt. The French found themselves bogged down in a costly and unproductive occupation, earning international condemnation. And for Germany, the economic consequences were apocalyptic. To pay the wages of millions of striking workers while having no industrial output, the government turned on the printing presses with a vengeance. They began printing money, not by the million, but by the trillion. The result was the most infamous economic collapse of the 20th century, the hyperinflation of 1923. It was a national trauma that seared itself into the German psyche. The currency became completely worthless. In 1914, the exchange rate was about 4 marks to the dollar. By November 1923, it was 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar. A lifetime of savings, meticulously accumulated by the prudent German middle class, the very bedrock of any stable democracy, was wiped out in a matter of months. Prudence was punished, and speculation rewarded. The social order was turned upside down. The chaos and despair created the perfect breeding ground for political extremism. Who was to blame for this nightmare? For many, the answer was simple: the democratic government that signed the treaty, the vindictive French who had invaded, and the international financial system that had allowed it to happen. It was in the midst of this very chaos, in a Munich beer hall in November 1923, that a little-known agitator named Adolf Hitler would attempt his first, failed grab for power. The reparations had done more than just bankrupt a state. They had begun to destroy a society. In the years that followed, the Allies, led by the United States, would attempt to restructure the payments through the Dawes and Young plans. But these were mere patches on a fundamentally broken system. The chains of debt remained, a constant source of political poison, until the Great Depression of 1929 shattered the global economy and made any further payments impossible, paving the final stretch of the road for Hitler's rise to power. The dismemberment. The treaty did not just attack Germany's pride and its wallet. It attacked the very body of the nation itself, dismembering a unified state and scattering its people. In total, Germany lost 13% of its European territory, all of its overseas colonies, and 10% of its population. Each cut was a new source of grievance. Alsace-Lorraine, the territory seized from France in 1871, was returned. The Saarland, a vital coal-producing region, was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years, its coal production given directly to France as a form of reparations. Eupen and Malmedy were given to Belgium, northern Schleswig to Denmark after a plebiscite. But the most volatile changes were in the east. Large parts of West Prussia and Posen, home to both German and Polish populations, were given to the newly created state of Poland to form the infamous Polish Corridor. This strip of land gave Poland access to the sea, but it cut East Prussia off from the rest of Germany, turning it into an isolated exclave. The port city of Danzig, overwhelmingly German, was declared a free city under League of Nations supervision, a constant source of friction between Germany and Poland. The small territory of Memel was given to Lithuania. The industrial region of Upper Silesia was partitioned after a bitter and violent plebiscite. These were not just lines on a map. These were towns, villages, farms, and factories. This was the creation of millions of ethnic Germans who now found themselves living as minorities in new, often hostile, countries. The 3 million Germans of the Sudetenland, formerly part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, were now citizens of Czechoslovakia against their will. Their plight would become Hitler's great pretext for the Munich crisis of 1938. The Polish corridor was a strategic and psychological nightmare for Germany, a constant, visible reminder of their defeat. Each lost territory was an open wound, and each German minority across the new borders was a political time bomb, waiting for a future demagogue to light the fuse with the rhetoric of national liberation and reclamation. The shackled army. For a nation steeped in the militaristic tradition of Prussia, a country whose very unification was forged on the battlefield, the final humiliation was the complete and utter disarmament of its armed forces. The once mighty German navy, which had rivaled Great Britain's and was a source of immense national pride, had been surrendered to the Allies and interned at the British naval base of Scapa Flow. But on June 21st, 1919, just days before the treaty was to be signed, the German commander, Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, unwilling to see his ships become trophies of war, gave a secret order. The great ships began to list, to settle in the water. Seacocks have been opened, watertight doors sealed. The ships slowly capsize and disappear beneath the waves in a final, dramatic, suicidal act of defiance. The Grand Scuttle was a symbolic gesture, but the terms of the treaty were absolute and designed to be permanent. The German army, the pride of the nation, the engine of its unification, was to be reduced to a mere 100,000 long-serving volunteers. It was explicitly designed not as an army, but as a domestic police force, incapable of fighting a foreign war. The restrictions imposed were stark. No tanks or armoured cars, no heavy artillery, no poison gas, no air force, Luftwaffe, no submarines, U-boats. The General Staff, the strategic brain of the German military for over a century, was to be abolished. The Rhineland, the industrial heartland bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. No German soldier, no fortification, was permitted within 50 kilometers of the river's east bank. Germany was to be rendered utterly defenseless, a giant shackled in the heart of Europe. But even as the chains were being forged, a small group of German officers were already planning how to secretly break them. The man tasked with commanding this tiny new army, the Reichswehr, was General Hans von Seeckt. Publicly, he complied with the treaty. Secretly, he defied it with breathtaking ingenuity. He envisioned the 100,000-man army not as a police force, but as a Führerheer, a leader army. Every single soldier was to be trained not for his own rank, but for the rank 2 levels above. The army was to be a secret cadre of future commanders, ready to expand at a moment's notice. Seeckt's defiance went even further. In 1922, the pariah states of Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Treaty of Versailles. Publicly, it was about trade. Secretly, it was a pact with the devil. In exchange for German technical expertise, the Soviets allowed the German army to establish secret bases deep inside Russia. Far from the prying eyes of Allied inspectors, German engineers designed and tested the very weapons forbidden by Versailles: new tanks, new artillery, and new aerial combat tactics. The foundations of the blitzkrieg machine that would later terrorize Europe were laid not in the 1,930 seconds under Hitler, but in the 1920 seconds, in the shadows of the Weimar Republic, in a secret alliance with the Bolsheviks. The message was clear. Germany might be shackled, but it would never stop planning for the day it would break free. Part 2. The Führer's Ladder, the rise of the agitator. In 1919 he was nobody. A failed artist from Austria, a decorated but friendless army corporal who had served Germany with fanatical devotion. In October 1918, temporarily blinded by a British gas attack, he was recovering in a military hospital in Pacewalk. It was there that he heard the news of the armistice and the Kaiser's abdication. The shock, he would later write, was his moment of political awakening. Hitler. So it had all been in vain. In vain all the sacrifices and privations, in vain the death of 2 millions. Had they died for this? So that a gang of wretched criminals could lay hands on the fatherland. The more I tried to achieve clarity on the monstrous event in this hour, the more the shame of indignation and disgrace burned my brow. I, for my part, decided to go into politics. After the war, Hitler returned to Munich, a city seething with chaos and conspiracy theories. The army, seeking to combat the spread of Bolshevism, appointed him as an informant. His job was to spy on radical groups. In September 1919, this assignment led him to a meeting of a tiny, irrelevant sect called the German Workers' Party, held in the back room of a smoky beer hall. He listened to the dull speeches, unimpressed. But when one speaker advocated for Bavarian separatism, something inside Hitler snapped. He leaped up and delivered a thunderous, impromptu tirade on the necessity of a strong, unified German state. The party's leader, Anton Drexler, was mesmerized by his raw oratorical power. He pressed a pamphlet into Hitler's hand and urged him to join. Hitler had not just found a party, he had found his stage. He quickly took over the party, redesigning its flag with the arresting swastika symbol and renaming it the National Socialist German Workers, or Nazi Party. And he honed his message into a brutally simple, powerful, and endlessly repeated catechism. Germany had not been defeated, it had been betrayed by the November criminals. The Weimar democracy was a foreign imposition, a disgrace, and the Treaty of Versailles was not a treaty, but a slave document, a diktat, designed to destroy the German people. He didn't just speak to the crowds, he channeled their deepest fears and hatreds. By 1923, with Germany in the throes of hyperinflation and national humiliation, Hitler believed his moment had come. He planned to replicate Mussolini's March on Rome by launching a putsch, or coup, in Munich, which he hoped would trigger a nationwide uprising against the traitors in Berlin. Hitler. The national revolution has begun. The Bavarian and Reich governments have been deposed. The barracks of the army and police are occupied. The swastika flag is flying. The next day, Hitler and 2,000 of his followers marched on the city centre, hoping to inspire the army to join them. But the police and army did not switch sides. At the Odeonsplatz they opened fire. The putsch collapsed in a hail of bullets. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen were killed. Hitler was arrested and put on trial for high treason. It seemed his political career was over before it had truly begun. But Hitler, the master propagandist, turned his trial into a triumph. He dismissed his own defense lawyers and spoke for hours, transforming the courtroom into a national stage. He admitted his intent to overthrow the Republic, but portrayed it not as a crime, but as a patriotic duty. Hitler. I am not a criminal because of that. If I stand here today as a revolutionary, it is as a revolutionary against the revolution of 1918. The army which we have formed is growing from day to day. I know that one day the hour will come when these wild companies will grow to battalions, the battalions to regiments, the regiments to divisions. Then from our dead bones and our graves the will of Germany will rise again, for it is not you, gentlemen, who pass judgment on us. That judgment is spoken by the eternal court of history. The sympathetic judges gave him the lightest possible sentence. 5 years in the comfortable Landsberg prison. He would serve less than 9 months. It was in Landsberg that he dictated his political manifesto, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. In its rambling, hate-filled pages, he codified his worldview, his racial theories, his belief in the need for Lebensraum, or living space, in the East, and his obsession with the Treaty of Versailles as the source of all Germany's ills. The failed putsch had taught him a valuable lesson. Power in a modern state could not be seized by force alone. It had to be taken from within. He would no longer be a revolutionary. He would become a politician. He would use the tools of democracy to destroy it, breaking the chains. During the mid-1920s, a period of relative stability and prosperity, Hitler's message of rage lost its urgency. The Nazi Party was a fringe movement, dismissed by many as a bizarre cult. But in 1929, the music stopped. The American stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. The American loans that had sustained Germany vanished overnight. Unemployment skyrocketed. The political center collapsed. Suddenly, Hitler's radical, simplistic message found a massive, desperate audience. He blamed the depression on the international financial system, which he linked to the Jews, and on the crushing reparations payments of the Versailles Treaty. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the German Reichstag. On January 30th, 1933, the old conservative establishment, believing they could control him, made him chancellor. After consolidating absolute power, Hitler began to make good on his promises. In March 1935, at a rally for the freedom to rearm, he announced that Germany was reintroducing military conscription and rebuilding its army to over 500,000 men. He officially unveiled the existence of a new air force, the Luftwaffe. It was a spectacular, flagrant violation of the treaty. Britain, France, and Italy formed the Stresa Front to condemn the action, but it was a paper tiger. Britain, in fact, signed a separate Anglo-German naval agreement just months later, effectively condoning Hitler's rearmament. The chains were beginning to break. The next test was even more audacious, a colossal gamble that could have ended his regime. On March 7, 1936, Hitler ordered 3 battalions of his new army to march back into the demilitarized Rhineland. This was a direct challenge to French security, a violation of not just Versailles, but the subsequent Locarno treaties which Germany had signed voluntarily. Hitler himself later admitted the immense risk. Hitler. The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking in my life. If the French had then marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. Our military resources would have been wholly inadequate for even a moderate resistance. But France was paralyzed. Britain, haunted by the memory of the Great War and with a nagging sense of guilt over Versailles, offered no support. The British attitude was summed up by Lord Lothian's famous remark that the Germans were merely marching into their own back garden. The Allies had lost their nerve. For Hitler, it was a profound lesson. His intuition about the weakness and division of his enemies was correct. He could be as aggressive as he wanted. The era of appeasement had begun. He tested his new military and Allied resolve in the brutal Spanish Civil War. Under the guise of fighting communism, his Condor Legion helped General Franco to power, using the conflict as a live-fire training ground. It was in the skies over Spain that the Luftwaffe perfected the dive-bombing and terror tactics of blitzkrieg, most infamously at the bombing of the Basque town of Guernica. The world was horrified, but did nothing. The road to war. Emboldened, Hitler's pace quickened. In March 1938, he bullied Austria into submission and annexed it to the Reich. Anschluss. The treaty was now little more than a historical document. Next, he turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, the prosperous, democratic state created by the peacemakers at Versailles. 3 million ethnic Germans lived in a border region of Czechoslovakia called the Sudetenland. Using his now perfected method, Hitler began to claim they were being brutally persecuted and demanded the region be returned to Germany. War in Europe seemed imminent, but the Allies, particularly Britain under Chamberlain, were desperate to avoid another war at any cost. At the infamous Munich conference, they chose appeasement. They agreed to Hitler's demands and forced the Czech government to hand over the Sudetenland with all its vital border fortifications. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a piece of paper signed by Hitler, and famously declared he had secured peace for our time. Churchill. You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war. Churchill was right. Just 6 months later, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and sent his troops to occupy the rest of Czechoslovakia. This was the final, shocking betrayal. It proved he was not just interested in uniting German-speaking peoples, he was bent on conquest. The policy of appeasement was dead. Britain and France finally guaranteed they would defend the next country on Hitler's list, Poland. Hitler's final move was his most cynical and shocking. To avoid a two-front war, he entered into a non-aggression pact with his ideological arch-enemy, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. The world was stunned. What the world didn't know was that the pact contained a secret protocol. In it, the two dictators agreed to carve up Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe between them. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was Hitler's green light. The road to war was now clear. His final demand was the one that had its roots in the very beginning: the abolition of the Polish corridor and the return of Danzig, creations of the Treaty of Versailles. When Poland refused, Hitler unleashed the Blitzkrieg. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun. The 20-year ceasefire was over. Part 4. The verdict of history. The counter-argument. Not harsh enough. The narrative seems so clear, so compelling. A harsh, vindictive treaty breeds resentment, which gives rise to a demagogue like Hitler, which leads directly to a second, more terrible war. This has been the dominant view for generations. But is it the only interpretation? For decades, a compelling counter-argument has existed, a verdict offered not by remorseful liberals, but by hard-nosed realists and military strategists. This argument posits that the true, catastrophic failure of the Treaty of Versailles was not its harshness, but that it wasn't nearly harsh enough. As a point of comparison, consider the peace that Germany itself imposed on a defeated Russia just 1 year earlier. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was a document of pure conquest. It stripped Russia of 1/3 of its population, half of its industry, and 90% of its coal mines. It was designed to permanently cripple Russia and turn Eastern Europe into a German colonial empire. Compared to that brutal victor's peace, the terms of Versailles, while punitive, look almost moderate. Germany, though reduced, losing 13% of its European land, was left largely intact, its industrial base still the most powerful on the continent, its population of 60 million people united in resentment but far from broken. No one understood this better than the man who had orchestrated the final victory, Marshal Ferdinand Foch. He was aghast at the terms. He believed the treaty was a dangerous half-measure. It was harsh enough to infuriate every German, but not harsh enough to permanently prevent them from seeking revenge. Foch's logic was that of a soldier, not a politician. He cared little for reparations or war guilt clauses. He wanted one thing: physical security for France. Foch. The Rhine is the frontier of all. Whoever holds its bridges holds the mastery of the country. We must hold them. We must have a barrier. We must have a wall. Foch argued passionately for the Rhineland to be detached from Germany entirely, creating an independent buffer state that would physically prevent a German army from ever again reaching the French border. When the politicians overruled him, settling for a temporary occupation and permanent demilitarization, Foch saw the future with perfect, chilling clarity. Looking at the final treaty, he famously and prophetically declared, "This is not a peace. It is an armistice for 20 years. For Foch, and for many historians since, the central failure was not the treaty's text, but the complete and utter collapse of the will to enforce it. The disastrous Ruhr occupation of 1923, which alienated Britain and nearly bankrupted France, taught the Allies a terrible lesson. Enforcing the treaty was costly, messy, and unpopular. It sapped their resolve. So when the real test came, when Hitler marched his fledgling army into the Rhineland in 1936, the one moment where he could have been stopped with minimal force, the Allies, haunted by the past and terrified of the future, did nothing. The treaty had failed not because it was too strong, but because its enforcers had become too weak. The American betrayal. A crucial part of that failure of will, perhaps the most decisive part, lay across the Atlantic. Woodrow Wilson may have been the chief architect of the League of Nations, the moral crusader for a new world order, but he could not convince his own country to join his crusade. The opposition in the U.S. Senate was led by the powerful Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Henry Cabot Lodge. The clash between Wilson and Lodge was not merely political, it was a titanic struggle between two fundamentally different visions of America's role in the world. Wilson, the internationalist, believed America had a divine mission to lead mankind into a new era of collective security. Lodge, the nationalist, believed that tying America to the League would subordinate its sovereignty to an international body, entangling the nation in endless European quarrels that were none of its business. Lodge. I am as anxious as any human being can be to have the United States render the fullest possible service to the cause of peace, but I will not vote for a League of Nations that is not safe for the United States. Our first ideal is our country. We would not have our country's vigour exhausted, or her moral force abated, by everlasting meddling and muddling in every quarrel, great and small, which afflicts the world. Lodge proposed a series of reservations to the treaty, designed to protect Congress's right to declare war. Wilson, stubbornly refusing any compromise, took his case to the people. In September 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, after delivering a passionate, desperate speech, the exhausted president collapsed. Days later, he suffered a massive, debilitating stroke. For the last 17 months of his presidency, Woodrow Wilson was an invalid, isolated from the public and his own government. The country was effectively run by his fiercely protective wife, Edith, who became known as the secret president. With Wilson incapacitated and unwilling to compromise, the Treaty of Versailles failed to achieve the necessary two-thirds majority in the Senate. The United States would never ratify the treaty. It would never join the League of Nations. This single act was a devastating blow from which the post-war order never recovered. It removed the world's rising economic and military power from the equation. It deprived the League of Nations of its most powerful potential member, rendering it a talk shop that was ultimately powerless to stop aggression. It left an exhausted Britain and a paranoid France to manage a resentful Germany alone. Wilson's dream of collective security, the very heart of his new world, was dead before it ever truly began, a casualty of his own idealism and the realities of American politics. The lessons learned. Perhaps the most compelling evidence for the failure of Versailles is what happened after the next World War. In 1945, the Allies once again faced a defeated, devastated Germany. At first it seemed they might repeat the mistakes of the past and even amplify them. The initial proposal favoured by some in the American government was the Morgenthau Plan. It called for the complete deindustrialization of Germany, the destruction of its mines, and its conversion into a pre-industrial agricultural state. It was Versailles on steroids, a plan born of the same impulse for vengeance that had animated Clemenceau. But this time, a different logic prevailed. The Morgenthau Plan was rejected. In its place came the Marshall Plan, an unprecedented act of enlightened self-interest. The United States invested billions to rebuild the European economy, including that of their former enemy. The logic, shaped by the new reality of the Cold War, was clear. A prosperous, stable and democratic West Germany would be a powerful ally and a bulwark against Soviet communism. A poor, resentful Germany would be a liability, ripe for revolution. Instead of reparations to punish, there was investment to rebuild. Instead of a war guilt clause to humiliate, there were the Nuremberg trials, which prosecuted specific Nazi leaders for their crimes, separating the guilt of a criminal regime from the collective guilt of an entire people. The most revolutionary step, however, came from France itself. In 1950, the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed something once unthinkable. He called for France and Germany to place their entire production of coal and steel, the very raw materials of war, under a common supranational authority. It was a visionary act designed, in his words, to make war between France and Germany not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. This Schuman Declaration created the European Coal and Steel Community, the direct ancestor of today's European Union. The peace after World War II was built not on vengeance but on reconciliation, integration, and shared interests. The victors, haunted by the memory of Versailles, had finally learned its most bitter lesson. Act V. Conclusion. The final question. So was the Second World War inevitable the moment the ink dried at Versailles. History is never a simple equation of cause and effect. History is made by human choices. The Treaty of Versailles did not, by itself, create Adolf Hitler or command the German army to invade Poland. The Great Depression, the centuries-old poison of anti-Semitism, the weaknesses of the Weimar Constitution, the charisma of a monstrous demagogue, the cowardice of appeasers all played their fatal parts. Yet, it is impossible to imagine Hitler's rise to power without the Treaty of Versailles. It was the soil in which his twisted ideology took root. It was the central unifying grievance around which he built his movement. It gave him his every talking point. It gave a wounded, proud nation a simple target for its complex anger. It undermined Germany's first fragile attempt at democracy from the moment of its birth. It lit a fuse and placed it in the heart of Europe. Then, for 20 years, a world of flawed and fearful men watched it burn. In the final analysis, the fatal peace of 1919 taught the world a terrible and costly lesson, one paid for with the blood of tens of millions. That a peace without a measure of grace, a peace built on righteous revenge, is merely a prelude to another, greater war. That humiliating a defeated enemy can create a monster far more dangerous than the one just vanquished. It is a lesson that echoes through our own time, a constant, solemn reminder that justice without wisdom is a dangerous thing, and that reconciliation is not a sign of weakness, but the only true and lasting foundation for peace among nations.